What if the man who watched you every day was the same man who promised never to love you for 5 long years? Kate Whitmore worked in silence. She was the loyal secretary, efficient, invisible, and utterly forgotten. Or so she thought. Until one winter evening, a forgotten door creaked open. A leather-bound journal whispered the truth. Her boss, the cold and untouchable CEO, had been writing about her all along. Why did he hide it? What was the promise that kept his love buried in silence? And what are the 6 words he never dared to say, until it was almost too late? This isn't a love story made of grand gestures or dramatic declarations. This is about 2 people who stayed too quiet for too long, and the one word that changed everything: stay. If you believe in quiet love, in second chances, and in healing through truth, like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories, let this story whisper its way into your heart. Now, let's begin. Every evening, when the office emptied and silence filled the halls, she stayed behind. Not because she had work to finish, but because she didn't want to go home to more silence. Kate Whitmore sat alone beneath the soft glow of her desk lamp, the click of her keyboard echoing in the large, open-plan office like a metronome counting down the final minutes of her day. Outside, the Boston sky had turned the color of tarnished copper, and the last golden leaves clung to the branches as if unsure whether to fall. The clock on the wall above the filing cabinet read 6:42 p.m. Everyone else had gone. The soft hum of the building's ancient heating system was the only sound left. That, and the occasional creak of wood expanding against the cool autumn air. Kate sipped lukewarm coffee out of a chipped ceramic mug she kept hidden behind her monitor. She didn't really need to be there. Her reports were done, emails sent. But the quiet was familiar, predictable. It was easier to be alone here than to go home to a place where the walls knew too much. She reached for the manila folder sitting to her right and began methodically sorting the documents inside. It wasn't urgent work, just end-of-quarter summaries that Grant liked in hard copy. He was particular about that. He didn't say much, but he always noticed when something was out of order. Grant Ellison. He wasn't the kind of man who needed to raise his voice to command attention. His presence filled a room with the same calm authority as a book left open on a desk, silent, but weighty. He had been a widower for nearly 7 years. Everyone in the office knew, but no one spoke about it. That was how things were with Grant Private, structured, unspoken. Kate had worked by his side for 5 of those years. 5 years of exchanging polite greetings, sharing elevator rides in silence, and coordinating meetings with barely a sentence passed between them beyond the professional. But sometimes, late in the day, when everyone else had left and the light turned soft and gold, he would pause outside her office, just long enough for her to feel it, the weight of something left unsaid. Tonight, as she placed the last document into the folder, she heard the faint, familiar cadence of footsteps against the wooden floor. Her hands froze. A moment later, a porcelain teacup was placed gently on the corner of her desk. She looked up. Grant stood there, tall and composed in a charcoal wool coat, the collar still dusted with a few stray maple leaves that clung like autumn's final breath. He didn't say anything, just gave her a nod, a small one, not quite a smile, but something close. She looked at the tea, chamomile, the kind she only drank on days when everything felt just a little too heavy. She hadn't asked for it, hadn't mentioned it, and yet, here it was, steaming gently in the silence. Their eyes met for a second, 2, 3. And then he turned and walked away, his footsteps receding down the corridor like a wave pulling back from shore. Kate stared at the door long after he disappeared. Then she reached for the teacup, wrapping her fingers around the delicate porcelain. It was warm, steady. Her heart wasn't. She hadn't allowed herself to imagine anything beyond their professional boundaries, but moments like this, quiet, subtle, full of things unsaid, left an ache that lingered long after the tea had gone cold. He was a man of few words, of measured movements. Once, during a coffee break, A younger assistant had whispered to her, "He's not cold. He's just carrying too much." Kate had smiled politely then, brushing it off. But now, sitting here in the half-light, she wondered if that was the truest thing she'd ever heard about him. She glanced at the clock again. 7:09 p.m. Boston was slipping into night outside, street lamps flickering to life, casting long shadows that danced across the sidewalks. Somewhere in the distance, she heard the low hum of a streetcar passing, the kind of sound that reminded her of old films and memories that didn't belong to her. She leaned back in her chair, exhaled slowly, and turned toward the window. There, in the reflection of the glass, she could still see the soft steam rising from her tea, and a thought crept in, uninvited but persistent. If he ever felt anything, would he even let me know? The question settled deep in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. Maybe it was foolish, maybe it was nothing. But 5 years of silence had taught her something about reading between the lines, about hearing the things people couldn't say. She looked at the teacup again, then back toward the hallway where he'd vanished. And in that stillness so vast, so loud, it wasn't answers she wanted. It was just the truth, even if it never came. She hadn't told anyone about that birthday. Not about the ring, or the voicemail, or the fact her mother died the same day she lost her fiancé. It had been 5 years, but certain memories aged like bruises slow to fade, and still tender when pressed. Kate rarely thought of that day unless something stirred it a certain scent. The sight of two people holding hands, or the silence between her and Grant that felt too familiar. She had been engaged once. That detail alone now felt foreign, like it belonged to someone else's life. They had picked a date, a venue in Vermont, and her mother had cried softly while helping her choose a lace-trimmed dress. Everything was ready, and then, within hours, it all collapsed. The call had come while she was icing cupcakes in her mother's kitchen. Her fiancé, Mark, had left a voicemail. He didn't come in person, just a short, panicked message, his voice breaking under guilt. There was someone else. There had been someone else for months. Kate had stared at the phone long after the message ended, waiting for it to ring again, to correct itself. It never did. An hour later, her mother suffered a heart attack. The doctors said it was sudden. Kate always wondered if it was just too much. The loss, the betrayal, the silence that followed. She buried them both that week, her mother and the future she thought she had. After that, she built herself a quiet life, one without promises or big feelings. Just work, a modest apartment, and a garden. She never watered but still managed to bloom each spring. Love, as far as she was concerned, had overstayed its welcome. At the office, she became the efficient, reliable Kate, Grant's right hand. She didn't need anyone to ask if she was okay, because she always was. Or at least, she appeared to be. But the body remembers. And lately, in the soft evenings filled with steam from a porcelain cup, and the weight of his gaze passing over her just slightly too long, something inside her had started to stir. She noticed the tea first. It wasn't always the same. Mondays after a restless weekend, it was peppermint clean and sharp, waking her senses. On gray rainy days, it was ginger with a touch of lemon. When her shoulders tensed from staring too long at spreadsheets, it was lavender and honey. She never asked for it, never mentioned preferences, but somehow, Grant always knew. It wasn't just the tea, it was the way he scheduled her meetings later on, mornings after her migraines, or how the office plants near her desk always seemed freshly watered, even when she forgot. It was the way her umbrella appeared near the door on forecasted rainy days, though she never left it there, and yet, he never said anything, not once. That paradox, that aching closeness wrapped in silence, began to eat at her in quiet ways. She started watching him when he didn't realize, the way his hand hovered a second longer over a document she'd handed him, the way his jaw tensed when she mentioned working late. There was a rhythm to their interactions, always professional, always distant, But buried inside that rhythm was a tenderness too practiced to be accidental. She remembered a line from an old book her mother used to love. Some people speak in silence louder than they ever could with words. Still, she found herself craving more than gestures, craving clarity, craving sound. One Thursday evening, just after the office lights had dimmed to their motion sensor glow, Kate finished her last email and leaned back in her chair. The city outside was alive with motion traffic, footsteps, the rustle of coats against cool wind, but inside, the building held its breath. Her tea sat beside her, cinnamon rooibos, warm, deep, comforting. It had been a hard week. Her old neighbor had passed away. Kate had helped the family sort through belongings, including a scarf her mother once knitted and loaned out years ago. Touching it brought everything back. The house, the kitchen, the silence that followed the last goodbye. And somehow, Grant knew. She wrapped her hands around the cup, staring at the ripples. Does he notice? Or care, she whispered to herself, though she already knew the answer. She didn't want to admit it, but the truth was harder to ignore now. His silence wasn't indifference. It was something else, something heavier, more careful. She stood slowly, needing to move. The office felt too small all of a sudden, like the walls had leaned in to listen too closely. She made her way toward the back hallway, her heels tapping softly against the wooden floor. That was when she saw him. At the far end of the corridor, past the row of closed offices and the corner copy room, there was a single door with a frosted glass panel. The library. No one used it anymore. It had been built decades ago, back when Ellison & Co. printed hardbound contracts and business ledgers. These days, most employees passed it without a glance. But not Grant. He stood there now, one hand on the doorknob, the other holding what looked like a small, leather-bound book. Kate froze. He hadn't seen her yet. His head was slightly bowed, shoulders sloped in a posture she'd never seen before, less like a CEO, more like a man remembering something he couldn't forget. Without a word, he slipped inside and closed the door behind him. Kate didn't move for a long moment. Something about the way he entered that room, it wasn't routine. It was reverent, secretive, like whatever was behind that door belonged to a version of him no one else got to see. Her tea still lingered on her tongue, warm and spiced, but inside her, a chill settled. There were things about Grant Ellison she didn't know. And maybe, just maybe, it was time she started finding out. She wasn't snooping. She was looking for an old ledger. That's what she told herself as she moved down the hallway with careful steps. The low heels of her shoes muted against the old oak floor. A project from years ago had resurfaced, and the accounting team believed a paper trail might still exist. Buried somewhere in the archive Grant insisted on keeping. The key to the back library was in the top drawer of the office manager's desk, marked with a yellow tag and left unused for months. Most people had forgotten the room existed. Kate hadn't. The door opened with a reluctant creak, revealing a space untouched by time. Dust floated in lazy swirls beneath a single overhead bulb. Shelves lined the walls, tall, narrow, heavy with forgotten volumes. The air smelled of aged paper, leather, and something else, something warm, almost nostalgic, like a coat pulled from the closet on the first cold day of autumn. She stepped inside and gently closed the door behind her. A small desk sat near the far corner, nestled under a brass lamp with a faded green shade. The light had been left on. That struck her as odd. Grant was meticulous about energy use, always the last to turn out lights at the end of the day. She moved toward the desk, eyes scanning for ledgers, files, anything that looked vaguely financial, and then she saw it, a leather-bound journal, brown, worn at the edges, thick, like it had been carried around, opened and closed hundreds of times. It sat slightly askew, as though someone had left in a hurry or didn't want to admit they had been there at all. Her hand hovered above it for a moment, suspended between respect and curiosity. But something called to her, not a sound, a pull. Like a thread tugging gently at the seam of her still-stitched heart. She opened it. The first page was blank. The second began with her name, Kate, April, 3 years ago. Her breath caught. The handwriting was unmistakably Grant's precise, neat, with that subtle rightward slant. She kept reading. Each entry was dated, some only a few lines, others filled entire pages, but every single one was about her, not in the way of obsession or confession. No, this was different. These were quiet observations, notes taken not from afar, but from someone standing close enough to notice the things most people missed. She hums when she works late, not songs, just a low, tuneless rhythm that seems to steady the room. When it rains, she wears that pale gray scarf, the one with the small snag near the edge. I wonder if she knows it's unraveling. She didn't drink her tea today. She looked tired. I didn't ask why. Kate's fingers tightened around the edges of the journal. Each page was a season, a moment, a memory she hadn't realized someone else was carrying. And it wasn't just the things she did. It was how she made him feel. When she laughs without holding back, something in my chest eases, like the world becomes a little less impossible. There's a softness in her eyes when she reads. Not sadness, not joy, something in between, something I wish I could name. I wonder what it would be like to be seen by her the way she sees the sky on cold mornings. Her heart was racing now. She hadn't realized she was breathing faster. Her skin flushed beneath the soft light, hands trembling slightly as she turned to the final page marked. It was written only a few weeks ago. Today. I stood in the hallway and watched her through the glass. She didn't see me. Or maybe she did, and pretended not to. I wanted to speak. I wanted to ask if she ever feels what I feel, this quiet ache of almost, but I didn't. I never do. And then the last line, if I ever speak the 6 words I've buried, I fear I will lose her. Kate's breath caught in her throat. 6 words. She read the sentence again, then again. Each time it landed differently, harder. She didn't know what the words were, but she knew deep down they were meant for her. Meant to be said out loud, not written behind locked doors. Her fingers loosened their grip, and the journal rested lightly in her palms. She wasn't sure how long she stood there, blinking, trying to gather her thoughts as the weight of 5 years shifted inside her. Part of her wanted to cry, not from pain, but from the strange, overwhelming feeling of being seen not through grand gestures or declarations, but through the patient, reverent act of noticing, of remembering. She turned to place the journal back, still unsure if she should say anything, still unsure what any of it meant, and that's when she heard it. Footsteps, slow, steady, familiar. They echoed down the hallway just outside the door, a rhythm she'd grown to know instinctively. Grant was coming back. For a breathless second, she stood frozen, the journal still open in her hands. She looked down at the final line one more time. 6 words. And now. She wasn't sure which she feared more, that he would speak them, or that he never would. There was a kind of pain that came not from betrayal, but from the truth being hidden too long. Kate stood motionless as the door opened behind her. The room, once filled with quiet curiosity, now pulsed with something heavier, like the weight of years collapsing into a single breath. The journal was still in her hands, the final page pressed lightly against her fingertips, as if the words had soaked into her skin. Grant stepped inside. He didn't rush. He didn't demand. His presence filled the space like the closing of a chapter, slow, inevitable, quiet. Their eyes met. His were steady, unreadable, but not cold, just tired. Not with her, but with what he carried. His voice, when it came, was low and almost gentle. You weren't meant to find that. There was no defensiveness, no accusation, just a strange softness, like someone standing at the edge of something long buried, finally ready to unearth it. Kate didn't respond, not at first. She couldn't. The silence between them now wasn't comfortable. It was crackling, thick with words neither of them had ever dared to say. She placed the journal back on the desk with care, as if afraid the motion alone might break whatever fragile understanding remained between them. He stayed near the door. 5 feet of air stretched between them, crowded with 5 years of missed moments and unsent thoughts. I wrote because I didn't know how to say it out loud. He finally admitted, there it was, the first truth. He didn't move closer. Instead, he spoke like someone rehearsing from a place deep within himself, each word deliberate, stripped of any performance. I started after the 3rd month. You had stayed late again. You laughed at something one of the interns said, and it stayed with me, longer than it should have. I realized I was paying attention in ways I couldn't afford. He paused, looking down at the rug beneath his feet. A faded blue pattern, worn from age, familiar, safe. I never intended for anyone to read it. Least of all you. Kate's arms remained at her sides, fingers curling slightly. There was no script for this, no rule book for what to feel. Her voice, when it came, trembled with something between anger and heartbreak. So, for 5 years, you watched me, noticed me, wrote about me in secret. And yet, in every meeting, every hallway, you made me feel like I was invisible. The words hung there. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her restraint made the wound even clearer. This wasn't rage thrown recklessly. It was precision pain, cut from quiet years. Grant's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. Kate took a step forward, eyes shining now, not with tears, but with all the truth she had buried alongside his. You say you wrote because you didn't know how to say it, but all you had to do was choose to speak. One time, one word, one moment, still, silence. He looked up then, and there was something in his expression that unsettled her remorse. Yes, but also something deeper. Like a man who had built walls for so long, he no longer remembered how to live outside them. I made a promise, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. To someone I lost. She blinked. Your wife. He nodded. Before she passed, she asked me not to fall again too quickly, not to bring someone into the life we built unless I was sure. I thought I was honoring her, but in doing that, I dishonored you. Kate's breath caught. It was a tragic kind of logic. A man trying to balance grief and guilt, who ended up turning his affection into silence. And somehow, she had been the one to pay for that balancing act. Do you even realize, she said quietly, what it's like to be loved in secret but ignored in person? He took a single step toward her, then stopped, as if unsure if he had the right. She didn't move. There was no scream, no dramatic storming out. Instead, she turned, walked past him, and left the room. When she returned to her desk an hour later, the air outside had shifted, clouds moved in over the city, and the glass reflected back her own tired eyes. She didn't cry. Instead, she opened her computer, typed a short letter, printed it, and folded it into an envelope with her initials in the corner, on her desk, beside the mug of forgotten tea. She placed her resignation, but she wasn't done yet. She walked to his office, the door closed now, the light off, and slid the envelope underneath. And beside it, she left something else, a single sheet of stationery, her handwriting, small but deliberate. Sometimes, the past finds you in the quietest places, like an attic in Vermont. Dust settled on memories no one dared to name. Kate hadn't planned on staying long. The old house in the woods had been vacant for nearly 2 years now, ever since she finally let the realtors take down the for sale sign and told them she needed more time. She never quite explained why. Maybe because she didn't know either. It was early October when she arrived. Vermont's trees set ablaze in their annual display of fire and gold. The porch creaked the same way it always had. The mailbox still bore the faded name Whitmore in hand-painted letters. Everything was exactly where her mother had left it, including the ceramic owl on the windowsill and the faint scent of cinnamon that clung to the air. She wasn't looking for anything. She told herself that as she unpacked her weekend bag and placed it beside the fireplace. She told herself again as she climbed the narrow attic stairs the next morning, wrapped in an old cardigan, her breath visible in the crisp morning air. The attic door groaned open. The space was lit by a single dusty window, angled just enough to catch the morning light. Old trunks lined the walls, each filled with folded quilts, forgotten letters, childhood drawings. Her mother had saved everything. Kate moved slowly, almost reverently, as though afraid she might wake something. In the far corner, beneath a box labeled Autumn Decor, she found a weathered photo album wrapped in a pale blue scarf. The leather cover was cracked at the edges, its corners softened by time and use. She opened it and then stopped breathing. The first few pages were ordinary family gatherings, birthday cakes, summer picnics with her mother smiling wide, arms wrapped around a younger Kate in pigtails. But halfway through, the tone changed. There, in the middle of the page, was a photograph she had never seen. Her mother, no older than 25, standing beside a tall man with dark hair and eyes that looked familiar, too familiar. She leaned in closer, squinting. The man wore a navy peacoat, the kind Kate had seen before in photographs, in portraits, even once in the hallway of Ellison and Co. It was him, not Grant, his father, Thomas Ellison. Kate flipped the page. More pictures followed, her mother and Thomas sitting by a lake, laughing at a picnic table, arms occasionally brushing in ways too intimate to be casual. There were notes written in the margins in her mother's handwriting, words like late September, still warm, and his hand found mine first. The air around her changed. Kate felt the chills settle in her bones, not the kind that came from a cold, but from old truths long buried rising to the surface. The last photo was the most telling. Her mother, sitting on a blanket, looking away from the camera, Thomas gazing directly at her, as if the world stopped moving around them. Kate shut the album slowly, hands trembling. The weight of it sank in. Their families weren't strangers. They were a story left unfinished, a story no one had dared to speak aloud. And Grant, he had known. Something deep inside her shifted. A knot she didn't even know she was carrying began to tighten. She sat there for a long while, the album still on her lap, her eyes fixed on the past captured in still frames. Her mind raced through every quiet moment, every hesitant glance from Grant, every kind gesture and unspoken word. Had it all been tangled in this? Was she simply the continuation of a story? Grant had inherited a story he'd been told not to rewrite. She descended the attic steps with slow, deliberate movements, her breath catching in her chest. By early evening, she sat alone on the porch wrapped in a knit shawl her mother had made the winter before she passed. The woods rustled gently around her, the sky shifting from gold to indigo. She clutched a cup of tea in both hands, though she hadn't taken a sip. She remembered the journal, the 6 words. If I ever speak the 6 words I've buried, I fear I will lose her. Maybe it wasn't just about emotions. Maybe it was about permission. Had Grant been carrying a promise not to her, but to someone else, a voice from another generation, a warning wrapped in love, in fear, in legacy? And maybe that voice belonged to his mother. Kate pressed her hand to her chest, trying to steady the thudding beneath it. She had always thought her choices were her own, that her life, her heartbreaks, her silences had been forged from within. But now it felt like she'd been living inside someone else's narrative, written by other hands, guided by other ghosts. She was furious not just at Grant, but at the quiet complicity of everyone who had known and said nothing. A life shaped by secrets, a love stunted by fear, and she, caught in the center of it all, never given the truth she had longed for. Tears came then, not loud, not dramatic, just soft, steady rivers down her cheeks. She didn't wipe them away. Instead, she sat there, letting the ache settle in her bones, letting the sorrow speak in the ways silence never had. For the first time in years, she let herself mourn not just her mother, or the man she almost married, or the career she just walked away from, but the fact that she had never truly been given the chance to choose. He didn't knock. He simply left a letter in the snow, just outside the porch light's reach. It had been snowing since mid-afternoon light at first, then steady, then thick enough to turn the Vermont woods into a soft, breathless world. Kate sat by the front window, wrapped in an old wool blanket, her fingers curled around a cup of untouched tea. The house was quiet, but her mind wasn't. She'd barely slept since finding the album. The image of her mother and Thomas Ellison still hovered behind her eyes, their smiles ghosting through memory and history. She'd grown up thinking she came from ordinary people with ordinary lives, only to learn she had always been part of someone else's unfinished story. And Grant. His absence felt louder than any words he'd ever said. She didn't expect him to come. After everything, her resignation, the 2 words she left behind, she imagined he'd let the silence speak for him, as he always had. But then, just after nightfall, the motion light on the porch flickered once. Kate glanced up, expecting a squirrel, maybe a gust of wind. Instead, she saw it a small, pale shape at the edge of the wooden steps, half buried in new snow. No footsteps, no sound, just the envelope. She opened the door slowly, the cold biting against her bare ankles as she stepped onto the porch. Her breath came in puffs. The world was hushed, the kind of quiet that only snow could bring. She picked up the envelope with shaking hands. It was heavy, thicker than she expected. Her name was written in his handwriting, strong, deliberate, slightly tilted forward. Back inside, she set the letter down on the table beside her untouched tea. The envelope felt warm now from the heat of her palms. Still, she hesitated. When she opened it, the paper was creased, written on both sides. No greeting, no preamble, just truth. He started with the story she now knew about their parents, about the photographs, about the past no one ever dared to explain. He told her he found the album years ago, buried in his mother's estate, that his mother had spoken of Kate's mother not with bitterness, but with unfinished sorrow, a story of love turned away by expectation and time. He told her about the promise, about how, during his mother's final weeks, she asked him quietly, firmly not to repeat the same mistake, that if ever he found himself drawn to Kate, he should walk away, that some histories were better left closed. And I tried, he wrote, God, I tried. I kept my distance. I built walls and silences and routines just to keep you from seeing too much. But you saw anyway. He confessed everything, the tea, the journal, the way he noticed her scarf was fraying before she did, the way her laugh lingered with him on train rides home, the way he listened for her footsteps each morning, even when he pretended not to care. I thought I was protecting you, the letter read, but really, I was protecting myself, from love, from loss, from my mother's shadow, and then the line she wasn't ready for. I kept my promise to her. But it cost me you. Kate set the paper down slowly, eyes wide, throat tightening. Her heart wasn't prepared for what came next. The final 6 words, written at the bottom of the page, alone, I love you, I always have. 6 words, finally spoken, though still not aloud. She folded the letter gently, her breath shaky. She didn't cry, not right away. Instead, she stared out the window at the snow falling heavier now, the light casting long shadows across the front steps where the letter had waited. Something inside her softened. But forgiveness? That would take time. She hadn't heard his voice in weeks. But when she played the old answering machine, there it was, quiet, broken, and still calling her Kate. The snow was still falling when she found the old machine in the drawer beside the fireplace, tucked under a pile of faded notepads and expired coupons. She had plugged it in on a whim, not expecting anything, perhaps longing for a voice other than her own. The blinking red light surprised her. One message, dated 5 days earlier. She hesitated, thumb hovering above the button. Part of her didn't want to hear it. She had read the letter. She had cried for what was lost. She had told herself she was done. But something inside her still ached for sound, for a voice to match the words written in the snow. She pressed play. His voice filled the room, soft and halting. There was no greeting, no formal opening, just his voice, raw, unsteady, human. I don't know if this is the right thing to do, he began. Maybe I shouldn't have called. Maybe silence would have been kinder. He paused. I read your 2 words over and over. Why silence? I've asked myself the same thing every day since you left. His breath caught faintly on the tape. The room, already quiet, seemed to lean in. I used to think silence was a form of strength, that love meant protecting people even from myself. But I see now. Silence can be its own kind of harm. Another pause. You deserved more than secrets, Kate, more than quiet gestures and closed doors. You deserve someone who chose you in the open. The message ended abruptly. No goodbye. Kate sat frozen, the machine's red light no longer blinking. She replayed it, twice. The third time, she let her hand fall to her lap and just listened. Really listened, not for answers, but for the weight behind each word. The voice of a man who was trying, late and clumsy, to find the courage he had buried for years. Her eyes wandered to the letter again. It was still on the table, creased now from being folded, held, pressed against her chest in too many moments of aching indecision. This time, she didn't skim. She read it slowly, word by word, line by line, like tracing someone's fingerprints in ink. He hadn't written to convince her. There were no dramatic pleas, no promises for a future he didn't know how to offer, just honesty and regret. I thought I could love you from a distance. One line said, I thought that would be enough. But I've learned that distance is not devotion. It's fear in disguise. And further down, I honored my mother's memory by breaking my own heart. It was a kind of confession she hadn't expected. Not grand, not poetic, just real. When she reached the final page again, she noticed something she had missed the first time. A slight bulge tucked in the fold at the bottom corner. She opened the crease gently. Inside was a photograph. Old, slightly faded. She recognized herself immediately standing at the memorial service for her mother, dressed in navy, her eyes cast downward. Her hand clutched the corner of the wooden bench, lips pressed tight as if to keep from trembling. But it wasn't just her in the frame. Behind her, almost out of focus, stood Grant, far enough to go unnoticed, close enough to catch every moment. His head was bowed, his coat dusted with early spring snow. He had been there, all this time. She thought he hadn't come, that he hadn't cared. But he had stood among the crowd in quiet solidarity, choosing not to intrude on grief, but not turning away from it either. Her fingers traced the edge of the photo. A lump rose in her throat, slow and sharp. All the years she had felt alone. Maybe she wasn't. Not really. Maybe love wasn't always loud. Maybe sometimes. It stood in the cold, in silence, waiting just behind you. She stepped out onto the porch, the letter in one hand, the photo in the other. The snow had softened the world to a hush again. It clung to the rails, to the trees, to her lashes. Her breath came out in clouds. She looked out at the spot where the letter had first appeared just beyond the porch light's reach. The snow had covered the footprints now. Whatever path he'd taken was gone, but the echo remained. A voice in the snow, a letter in her hands, a photograph that changed everything. She packed light just one bag, one notebook, and no promises. The train ride from Vermont to Boston felt longer than usual, though she'd taken that route dozens of times before. This time, it wasn't just distance being measured in miles. It was everything else, the silence that stretched between one heartbeat and the next, the memories tucked into the folds of her scarf, the letter still folded in the inside pocket of her coat. Kate didn't tell anyone she was coming. She wasn't ready for questions. She wasn't even sure she had answers. She arrived just after noon on a gray Tuesday. The city was caught between season-fallen leaves scattered on wet sidewalks, Christmas lights already appearing in shop windows, though Thanksgiving hadn't yet come. The office building looked the same, too familiar, too clean, the kind of place that tried to erase emotion in favor of efficiency. The receptionist glanced up, startled. "Oh, Kate." Kate nodded, offering a soft smile. "Just here to collect a few things." The woman fumbled for words but said nothing. Kate appreciated that. No apologies, no awkward condolences, just space. She moved through the lobby with steady steps, past the glass doors, past the fern that always drooped in winter no matter how much water it received, past the wall where the framed portraits of the executive board hung like silent witnesses. Her desk was still there, everything untouched, the mug with the faint chip at the rim, the pen she'd been meaning to replace for months, a photo of her mother in the corner, slightly crooked. She exhaled slowly, then began packing. No rush, no drama. Just one item at a time. She didn't take everything, only what mattered. A few books, the blue cardigan she used to drape over the back of her chair, a half-filled notepad. She left the mug. She didn't know why. Maybe some part of her hoped she'd come back for it. Or maybe she knew she wouldn't. The office felt quiet, even with the hum of phones and muted conversation in the background. People moved around her coworkers she'd known for years, but no one interrupted. They watched with the kind of respect reserved for someone who had once belonged, but now existed just outside the circle. When her box was full, she didn't leave. Not yet. Instead, she turned and walked down the hallway, past Grant's office. It was open, empty. His chair sat tucked in, desk clear, except for a single stack of files and a glass paperweight in the shape of a compass. As if someone had tried to clean the space but hadn't known quite what to remove. She continued walking until she reached the door at the end of the hall, the library. The door creaked just like before. The scent books and old wood and faint tea leaves wrapped around her like a memory. Nothing had changed. The leather-bound journal still rested on the desk beneath the green-shaded lamp. It waited, like it had always been waiting. Kate stepped inside. She ran her fingers along the edge of the chair before sitting down. The journal opened easily. She flipped past the familiar pages, her laughter, her scarf, her tea, each entry a quiet echo. And then she reached the last page. The final 6 words still lingered at the bottom. I love you, I always have. She stared at them for a long time. Then, from her coat pocket, she pulled a pen. She turned to the very last blank page and wrote, slowly, deliberately. You don't get to speak 6 words and disappear. She didn't write anything more. She closed the journal gently and placed it back where it had been, aligning the edges just so. As she stood to leave, a voice behind her made her pause. He hasn't been back. Kate turned. It was one of the younger employees. Michael, she remembered, new to the firm when she left. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, hands in his pockets. He left the same day you did, Michael continued. Word is, he closed the Ellison Beach House, the one on the Cape. Kate blinked. I thought he lived in the city, she said softly. He used to. The beach house was his wife's place. After she passed, he kept it but never stayed long. I think he's there now, alone. She nodded. Michael hesitated, then added, he hasn't said much, but he looked different, like something broke. Kate didn't reply. She walked past Michael, back through the office, past the lives that had once filled her days with noise and purpose. Outside, the air was colder, the sky hung low with clouds, the streets were wet, glistening with early frost. She clutched the strap of her bag tighter. That evening, she didn't go back to Vermont. She rented a car. She turned south, toward the coast. Not because she was chasing him, but because something inside her had shifted. She wasn't looking for closure. She wasn't even looking for reconciliation. She was looking for truth, for herself. The house by the sea had stood empty for years until now. She could feel the ghost before she even knocked. It was the kind of house that carried the weight of memory in its bones, weather-worn shingles, salt-stained windows, a narrow path winding through dune grass, soft with the hush of wind and time. The ocean beyond was restless, the sky a dull pewter gray, low and expectant. Kate stepped from the gravel drive to the front porch, her boots soft against the aging wood. The house didn't feel abandoned, not exactly, more like it had been holding its breath for a long time. The door was unlocked. She didn't knock. Inside, the air was still but lived in. A faint scent of peppermint and old books clung to the walls. The radiator clicked softly in the corner. Somewhere in the back, a turntable spun a slow, trembling piece of classical music strings, barely audible, like someone humming from a dream. She set her bag down by the coat rack and walked further in. The floors creaked beneath her. Photographs lined the hallway, sepia-toned faces she didn't recognize. A wedding portrait faded by time. A boy who might have been Grant in suspenders and bare feet, holding a fishing rod beside a man with the same bone structure. The house wasn't grand. It was a place for keeping quiet things, a place for reading on rainy afternoons, a place for grief. She followed the music. At the end of the hall, a door stood half open. She paused, then pushed it gently. He was there. Grant. Sitting in a leather armchair, half turned toward the window where the sea pounded gently against the shore far below. He held the leather journal in his lap, open to a page somewhere in the middle. He didn't startle when she entered, didn't speak. He simply looked up, eyes weary, unsure, and met her gaze. Kate stood still. The silence between them was different now. It wasn't the silence of avoidance, or fear, or secrets. It was something raw, like a space held open, waiting for the right words to come through. She took a step inside. The room was warm, paneled in oak, the scent of mint tea rising from a cup on the side table. A fire crackled softly in the hearth, more embers than the flame. She looked around, nothing extravagant, just shelves of books, a wool blanket draped over the back of a second chair, the edges of a chessboard half set up on a side table, as if waiting for a game long delayed. Her voice, when it came, was steady, not cold, not forgiving, just honest. "I read every word," she said. He didn't move. She took another step forward, her fingers trailing the edge of the bookshelf as she passed. "But I came here," she continued, "to ask what you left out." He closed the journal, slowly, not because he didn't want to answer, but because he knew this moment deserved more than reaction. Grant's eyes searched hers not to evade, but to find the version of her that was standing there now. Not the woman in the office, not the silhouette in the doorway 5 years ago, not the memory he had written about in silence, but Kate, the one who had come here with no promises, the one who had crossed the distance between fear and hope on her own 2 feet. He didn't look away. He rested the journal on the armrest, fingers still curled gently around its spine. Then, with quiet deliberateness, he sat forward, no words yet. Just a man trying to gather the kind of truth that had cost him more than he knew how to say. Outside, the wind shifted, tugging at the window panes. The fire popped once, and still, Kate waited. Some truths come not with thunder, but with the whisper of someone finally saying your name the way it was meant to be said. The fire had died down to embers, casting soft shadows that flickered like memories against the walls of the old study. Kate sat in the chair across from him, her hands folded quietly in her lap, fingers brushing against the edge of her coat sleeve, where the stitching had begun to unravel. Grant leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, the journal still beside him. Closed now, its words no longer the only ones between them. He exhaled slowly. "When my mother was dying," he began, voice low. She spoke more about the past than she had in 20 years. Kate didn't move. "She told me about your mother, about how once, long before either of us were born, they almost chose each other." He paused. "Almost," he repeated, "but something fear. Maybe family expectations. Maybe time kept them apart. And that almost, it haunted her." He turned toward the window, as if watching the ocean could help him steady himself. "She made me promise," he said, "that if I ever saw the same story unfolding again, I would end it before it began." Kate felt her breath catch in her chest. "She was afraid," he continued, "afraid that the echoes of their choices would reach you, that if we fell into each other, the old pain would resurface, and we'd be dragged under before we even knew how to swim." He looked at her then, eyes tired not from age, but from carrying too many unsaid things for too long. So I stayed silent. I stayed close enough to care, but far enough to hide it. I convinced myself that was love. He shook his head, the corner of his mouth tightening, not in anger, but in regret. But it wasn't. He said it was fear, and fear doesn't protect, it only postpones pain. Kate shifted slightly, her eyes on the floorboards between them. She traced a knot in the wood with the tip of her shoe. The fire cracked once, like a punctuation mark in a conversation too long, paused. Grant leaned back, his hands now clasped loosely. "I wrote those words," he said, his voice softening. "Every single page in that journal was the only way I could let you in without breaking my promise." He looked at her. Really looked, but I should have broken it. Silence again, but this time, it didn't weigh them down. It held space for something new. Finally, Grant spoke again. "If I had one more moment with you," he stopped, swallowed. "I'd say it out loud." Kate lifted her gaze. The air between them shifted. She tilted her head just slightly, her voice almost a whisper. Then, "What are you waiting for?" The moment held its breath. Grant leaned forward, just a fraction, and then, with the quiet surety of someone who had waited too long but never stopped hoping, he said the 6 words not written, not imagined, not hidden in tea or gestures or pages, but spoken, out loud. "I love you. I always have." The wind rattled gently against the windows. Somewhere in the kitchen, the old radiator groaned. Kate didn't cry. Not this time. She smiled. Small, barely there. But real. It was the kind of smile that didn't come from being rescued or from hearing the words she had longed for. It came from recognition, from seeing him, truly, in the space between pain and peace. Love isn't just found, it's chosen, rewritten, and lived page by page, together. The winter sun came early to the Cape, sliding its pale gold light through salt-kissed windows, warming the corners of the old house 1 inch at a time. Outside, the sea stretched calm and endless. Inside, the fireplace crackled softly, the kind of sound that asked nothing but to be heard. Kate stood barefoot in the study, sleeves rolled up, holding a duster in one hand and a cup of tea in the other. The scent of mint and lemon balm followed her as she moved from shelf to shelf, brushing the spines of old books that had gathered years of quiet. Grant was behind her, rearranging a stack of yellowed photographs and newspaper clippings, some of his parents', some of hers, some of people neither of them recognized anymore. The silence was comfortable now, not avoidance, not restraint, just space where 2 people could breathe beside each other. They had started, not over, but forward. There was no grand declaration, no sudden reunion kiss, just mornings like this full of small gestures, shared routines, and the delicate trust built not from promises, but presence. The journal stayed closed on the corner of the desk. Instead, a blank notebook sat between them now. Kate had begun writing again, not letters, not confessions, stories, short ones, fragments, really, snippets of quiet winters, overheard laughter, cups of tea poured without being asked. None of the characters had names, but anyone who read closely would know who they were about. Sometimes, Grant would read over her shoulder, saying nothing, just smiling in that quiet way of his. And sometimes, when she caught him doing so, she would pretend not to notice, but she always wrote more that day. They spent their afternoons clearing the study, dusting off the years that had gathered like cobwebs. Each item became a chance to learn something new about the other. Kate learned that Grant's mother used to read aloud to him every Sunday evening, that he kept a copy of her favorite poetry collection, its spine frayed, its corners folded. Grant learned that Kate once dreamed of illustrating children's books, and that her first sketchbook was hidden in a shoebox beneath her bed back in Vermont. They didn't try to make up for lost time. They lived in the now, with quiet reverence. Some evenings, Grant would return to Boston for board meetings, but this time he didn't leave her behind. He didn't ask her to return to her old role. He asked her to partner with him. The office had changed, not its walls, not its glass doors, but the way he spoke to the team, the way he made room for her voice in every meeting, every plan. He didn't place her beside him like an ornament. He made her space equal. She accepted not because she needed the title, but because they both knew they worked well together, always had. But now, it came with honesty. Now, she could look across the boardroom table and know she was not invisible. One morning, as they sat in the study with mugs in hand, the air still thick with the scent of firewood and ink, Kate closed her notebook and looked up. "This time," she said softly, "let's not wait 5 years to say what matters." Grant looked at her, then at her hand, resting on the edge of the table. He reached over not suddenly, not dramatically, just enough to let their fingers meet. The light caught the edges of her nails, the curve of his wrist. Nothing bold, just skin against skin, familiar and new all at once. He nodded. No need for more words. They didn't plan the future in great detail. They didn't talk about weddings or timelines or endings. They talked about pages, stories they'd write together, moments they'd choose to stay for. Love is a sentence, but it's the word stay that makes it complete. The morning was the kind only early spring could bring, where the air still carried the bite of winter, but the sun arrived early, warming the ground like a promise. Kate stood by the edge of the lake near her childhood home in Vermont, her boots pressing soft impressions into the thawed earth. Beside her, Grant walked in quiet rhythm. Their shoulders didn't touch, but every now and then, the sleeves of their coats would brush. She didn't pull away, neither did he. The lake shimmered under the morning light, patches of ice still clinging to the shaded coves, stubborn and delicate. The trees around them were bare but stirring, their buds still hidden, but certain. It had been 3 months since they opened the study in the Cape together, since they started writing sometimes with pens, sometimes just with how they chose to live. No big declarations, no timelines, just mornings like this. The air smelled of wet pine and thawing leaves. Kate slowed her pace, her hand brushing the low wooden fence that had been there since she was a child. She remembered tracing that same line with her fingers at age 12, 16, 29, now 37, older, wiser, maybe, certainly quieter. "I used to have this dream," she said, her voice just above the wind. Grant glanced at her but didn't speak. "In it," she continued, "I lived in a house full of windows. There was light in every room. I'd sit at a desk that looked out over this lake. And there was someone else there, too. Not always talking, not always close, but always there." She smiled faintly, her breath fogging in the cool air. "I never saw his face. But I remember the sound of the floor creaking when he walked past. I remember the smell of coffee, and the way he always came back." She stopped walking. The breeze curled gently around them. "I think I dreamed it so often because I didn't believe it could happen," she said, "that someone could stay, not just in the good moments, but in the quiet ones, the dull ones, the ones that hurt." Grant stepped closer. He didn't speak at first. He looked out at the lake, his expression calm, not guarded, not afraid, just present. Then, slowly, he reached for her shoulder, a hand, warm and steady, rested there, the kind of touch that didn't press or pull, just remained. "When I wrote those 6 words," his voice came softly, "I thought the first 5 were the truth." She turned to him, eyes steady. "But the 6th one," he said, "was the one I meant most." He didn't need to repeat it. The word was already there. Stay. It echoed in the stillness around them, in the soft lapping of water against stone, in the distant call of a loon, in the whisper of branches stirring overhead. They stood there for a while, no longer searching, no longer explaining. Not everything needed to be spoken. Later, they walked the winding path back through the woods. Sunlight flickered through the branches, dappling the ground with patches of warmth. A squirrel darted across their path. Somewhere deeper in the trees, a woodpecker tapped its steady rhythm. At the cabin, the porch chairs were just as Kate remembered, slightly weathered, one of them leaning a little too far to the left. She sat in the right one, pulling her knees up, wrapping her arms around them. Grant joined her a moment later. There was no talk of what came next, no discussion of forever. But as she leaned her head slightly toward his shoulder, and as his hand found hers without needing to search, it was clear this was a kind of forever, too. Not promised, not performed, but chosen, again and again, in the quiet mornings and long evenings, in the way two people could find one another, not through declarations, but through the decision to remain. Sometimes, love isn't loud. It doesn't arrive with fireworks or grand gestures. Sometimes, it waits quietly, patiently behind years of silence, behind closed doors and unopened letters. This story reminds us that the deepest connections in life are not always about words spoken, but about presence, about staying, about choosing someone every day, even when it's hard, even when it's late. We often let fear speak louder than love. We keep quiet to protect others or ourselves, only to realize too late that silence has its own cost. But healing doesn't come from rewriting the past. It begins the moment we choose to be honest, to show up, to stay. For anyone who has loved in silence, who's waited too long to say what matters, this story is a gentle whisper. It's not too late. Because love, in its truest form, is not about perfection or timing. It's about courage and the choice to stay again and again. Thank you for spending your precious time with us and letting this story gently walk beside you. If it touched your heart, even just a little, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories. Your support helps us continue to bring quiet, meaningful stories to those who need them most. Until next time, stay kind, stay open, and remember, sometimes the softest stories leave the deepest mark.